Alright guys, MTech Guy here. We're going to be taking a look at the E60 M5 today and what to look out for if you're in the market to buy one of these cars. So in this video we're not going to go into the features of the car, you know, V10 engine, SMG Gearbox, and we're not going to go into model year changes, things like that. Nor are we going to look at what to consider when you're making the decision whether to buy one of these cars or not. We're going to be working on the presumption that you've considered how it's going to fit in with your lifestyle, your finances, and you've made the decision, yep, I want to buy one, I'm going to pull the trigger. So what do we need to look out for when we go looking at one of these cars? Okay, so there's a few things to consider on the list, but we'll start off with the obvious thing, mainly the panel and the paint. Just make sure the car's nice and straight, make sure the paint's in good shape, make sure the wheels aren't too beat up. But the other thing to think about with the M5 is that the front end of the car's all aluminium, so basically everything from the bulkhead onwards is aluminium. So if there is any accident damage there, it's going to cost you more money to either replace panels or repair the structure of the cars, so just do keep that in mind. It's also worth taking a good look at the brakes on the car. You can see on the M5 you've got them huge discs and calipers. Now normally when you're looking at buying a car, you might think, oh yeah, it needs discs and pads coming up, so you know, whatever, not a big deal. But on this car, the brake discs are huge money. The discs and pads are going to cost you a lot of money, so if the discs are showing a reasonable lip there, or there's a lot of wear on the pads, just consider you're going to have a reasonable expense coming up. And once you've checked out the brakes and you're still looking in this area, it's worth having a good nosy at the shocks and the struts. Now, the E60 M5 has what they call the EDC Suspension. So basically what that is you've got adjustable shocks on these cars, and you've got a button inside the car where you can change between comfort, normal and sports settings. Now when the car's set in its sports setting, the shocks are super harsh, super stiff, and what can happen over time is if you've been hitting any decent bumps in the roads or reasonable potholes, what it can do is cause damage to the seal and cause them to leak. This can also happen over time as well as the seals become degraded and worn. So you want to be watching out for, if you just have a good look down here, just where the ledge there is for the spring, you want to just look for any moisture around there. Just check that they're not leaking oil, and if they are, it's going to cost you a reasonable amount of money. They're super expensive, the shocks and struts on these cars, with them being the EDC. So just consider, if you can see any fluid leaks on there or on the legs of the shocks, just be aware that it's going to cost you a lot of money to replace them. Then next up, it's worth sticking your head under the car and having a good look at the rear differential. Now just check out that rear aluminium cover to start off with. People have been known to jack up on them over time and they can break. You've got that bit of an egg crate effect there. They are quite brittle, so just make sure that's in good shape. And then just go around the side and have a good look at the seals as well. If there's any moisture around the diff, if there's any oil residue. These are super common for having the pinion seals leaking, the seal at the front. So just check that out and just consider the costs involved in getting that sorted out if you do go ahead with the car. And while we're on the subject of the differential, do have a good listen to it when you take the car for a test drive. Now, when the car's cold, if it's been sat around for a while, when you make some sharp turns, you might hear a little bit of a knocking noise from the rear, but it should come right. If not, this can often be remedied just by changing the fluid out later on. But if you've been driving the car for a few minutes and you're still getting a real sort of knocking, grinding noise from the rear, real grunching noise, that's something to worry about. And also when you're heading off down the road, if you're getting a decent whine from the back end as well, that's also something to think about. You might be coming up for a differential rebuild, or it might want some work there, so do consider that. Now then, SMG Gearbox. Now the biggest failure points are the solenoids and the pump itself, usually with them gearboxes. Now if you do find issues with the pump itself, it's 9 times out of 10 it's usually the electric motor driving the pump. Now when you come to look at the car, it's worth just, when you come to unlock it or when you open the driver's door, you'll hear that pump prime, so just have a good listen to it, make sure it sounds real positive, and also that it's not going on for too long, because that's priming the accumulator ready for the pump, ready for when you drive away. So just have a good listen to that, make sure it sounds nice and positive, and it sounds all good. Now if there are any real issues with the gearbox, the engine computer will pick up on these faults and you'll see either a yellow or red cog on the dash, so just watch out for that on the warning lights there. And also when you take the car for a test drive, you want to be thinking about clutch wear. So when you initially pull off in first gear, just have a good feel for any real clutch slippage. Now just remember that when the gearbox is in its first setting, it has 5 or 6 settings altogether, it will slip the clutch a little bit just to make it feel much smoother, so just allow for that. But if you're getting any real slippage or a bit of a snapping feel, then it's indicating that the clutch is looking like it might want replacing in the near future. So when you do drive the car, just keep in mind that the gearbox works on adaptions. So what it'll do over time, the computer will look at your driving style and it'll adapt the way the gearbox operates to suit you, to make it super smooth. Now, so it might feel a little bit clunky when you first take it for a test drive. It's unlikely that it's going to become adapted to you during a test drive, so just keep that in mind, and do try it in the first setting, the third setting and the fifth setting. Just have a good feel that, you know, the further up the range you go, it should be changing much quicker. The further up the rev range you go, it should be doing the same. So just make sure it's doing everything it should do. Now around the front of the car, down the bottom here, where you see this lower grille in the front bumper, just behind there we've got an oil cooler for the engine. Now these is super common for these to start to leak, especially at this age, so just have a good look at that. Stick your head underneath, make sure there's no oil coming from that. If there is, then that's something that's going to want fixing further down the road. Alright, so taking a look in the engine bay, of course we've got the V10 engine here. Now first off, you just want to look for any obvious things, you know, the usual stuff. Make sure all the panels and the plastic pieces are all in the correct place, nothing's missing. Also check all the wiring, make sure that none of it's sort of been busted or coming apart or butchered. And then have a good look around the engine. It's worth taking a torch and just look for any oil leaks. And while you're there with your torch, just take a good look down the gaps in the engine bay here, right down to the top side of that plastic under tray for the engine bay. Now you want to be looking for white watermarks, water stains, and that'll indicate that there could possibly be a coolant leak, so it's worth checking out also and considering. And of course you've got the hydraulic power steering with the E60 M5, so it's worth just checking around the reservoir area there and the hoses that go down to the bottom. If there's any leaks there, it's something you're going to want to replace. The hoses themselves, and also the reservoir that has a filter in it, so it's worth changing that out also. And it's pretty common just for the O-ring on the cap there to leak, so do consider that too. And also check out the coolant reservoir here, make sure it looks like it's in good condition, no splits, no leaks, and then just check the hoses and the lines also for leaks. Now then, with the engine itself, if there is anything just slightly wrong with it, the engine management on these cars is super sensitive and it's super overprotective of these engines. So any tiny fault, even a slight misfire, the car will come up with a limp mode or reduced engine power. It'll come up with a fault on the dash, so that's going to let you know if there's anything not quite right with the engine. If that is the case, it's worth getting the car scanned, whether you get a garage to do that or whether you take a cheap BMW specific scanner. Just have a look at the codes. It'll give you an idea of what it might be, but usually it'll take much more further diagnostics to pinpoint the actual fault itself, so do keep that in mind. Now, one of the real common faults on these engines is the throttle actuators. So you've got 10 individual throttle bodies, 5 on each bank of the engine, and then you've got one throttle actuator on each side, one for each side. So what can happen is they can fail over time. The plastic gears in them can become worn over time and they can start to fail, and also the electric boards in them can fail also. Now if that is the case with the car that you're looking at, even if one side's failed, the car's going to be just about undrivable, and also it's going to be throwing codes up on the dash, so you're going to have a good idea straight away. Another area that can cause issues is the Vanos system itself. Now that compromises of the Vanos pump that's right down the front of the bottom of the engine, and then you've got the Vanos units themselves, one on the end of each head, and each of them have got 2 solenoids in each. Now the solenoids can fail over time. The pump itself can become damaged if the rod bearings have failed, or if you've had any particles in the engine. So if you're ever in there to do the rod bearings, it's worth pulling the pump apart and having a good look at it. There was a revised design that was fitted later on, or around 2007ish, but if the car's been looked after properly, you shouldn't have an issue with that. And another part of the Vanos system is you've got a high pressure oil line which resides in the front of the sump. It's actually inside the sump, Now that can leak over time. It is a common failure point on these. It does take a few years to rear its ugly head, but if there's no record of it being replaced in the history, the service history of the car that you're looking at, do consider that it might be worth changing it out, because it can cause a lot of problems later on. And then of course, if you got the oil pan off to do that, it's worth just pulling that Vanos pump apart and having a good look at it, give it a good inspect, and also consider changing the rod bearings out at the same time. Whether they're worn or not, it's just a good opportunity for that preventative maintenance to get done. So if there's no record of any of that work being done, as a preventative measure, it is worth considering once you bought one of these cars, get the high pressure oil line changed out, get the Vanos pump inspected, and consider that you might have to replace parts of it or all of it, and also get them rod bearings changed out as a preventative measure. And then once all that's sorted, you know that as long as you look after the car properly, as long as you let it warm up properly and you give it regular oil changes, you shouldn't have any issues for years to come. Now maybe you're able to do that work yourself. That's going to save you a ton of money and labour. As far as rod bearings are concerned, any competent mechanic should be able to do that efficiently, but with the high pressure oil line and the Vanos pump, you're far better off getting a mechanic who knows these engines, maybe a BMW specialist, even if it's an independent, just someone who knows these engines, understands them, get them to do the work, and you should be all good to go. Now as far as rod bearings are concerned, just keep in mind that this is a high revving, high compression, 507 horsepower V10 engine. It's derived from a Formula 1 engine, so we're not looking at just like an everyday Camry engine here. It is a high performance engine, and with that comes a responsibility to look after it properly. Now you have got to view the rod bearings as a wear item. They are sacrificial, so when you're looking at the car, just have a good listen right down the bottom of the engine. Now if you hear any knocking noise or anything that doesn't sound uniform, it doesn't sound right, that could indicate that there's an issue with the bearings themselves. Now you should be able to get a reasonable life out of the rod bearings as long as the car's been warmed up properly before it's been driven hard, and as long as the oil's been changed out regularly. Now it's not unusual to get at least 80,000 miles, 120,000 Ks before you even start getting any concernable wear, so do keep that in mind. If you're up towards that sort of mileage or just past it, then do consider getting them bearings changed out as a preventative maintenance item. But as long as the car's been looked after, you shouldn't have any issues. But of course, when the cars are getting this old, it's likely the cars had 5-6 owners probably. The last couple of owners might have looked after it properly, might have driven it carefully, been mindful of the rod bearings, but the first few owners could have just driven the crap out of the car. So if you want absolutely 100% certainty, you want to be thinking about getting the rod bearings changed out as a preventative maintenance item. And when you stood here with the bonnet open, inspecting the car, that you got your eye on here, and you got the engine running, once you started up from cold, due to the nature of these engines, the design of them, it almost sounds like a diesel engine. They can be very noisy compared to most BMW engines, like these 6-cylinder ones that sound very smooth, feel very smooth. These, although they're very smooth to drive, they're very, very noisy, so you hear like a diesel noise. Even when they're warmed up, you can still hear a bit of noise. It does frighten a lot of people off, it does scare a lot of people. Don't be too perturbed by it. Just listen for any real abnormal noises, out of the ordinary noises, but do keep in mind that most of that noise comes from the Vanos system itself. The pump is actually gear driven down the bottom there, so of course you're going to get a bit of noise from it. With the gear noise itself, you will get a bit of noise there, so don't be too perturbed, but just approach it with a bit of common sense. Also check out the headlamps. Now these can fade over time, the plastic covers, and they're not replaceable on these. You've got to replace the whole unit. Now you can have these sanded and polished and they'll come up pretty good, but of course once you start doing that, you get past that original protective coating and then they'll just continue to fade over time and you're forever cleaning them up. Also check for any moisture in there. Now that can cause issues with the adaptive headlamps. There's some motors down the bottom of the headlamp there and a wee module. They can become faulty over time. That'll normally throw a code and a warning light on the dash. Alright, so moving under the car again, it's worth having a good look at the exhausts, the mufflers. Now although they're a very well built, very robust system on these cars, a lot of them have got hacked up over the years. They've had the cats removed, they've had the mufflers removed or changed out. Now there are some real good catback systems out there, really well built. So if it's got one of them systems on, you shouldn't have any trouble. But of course, if it's had all the cats removed and it's been butchered, just check it out, check the exhaust out, make sure it's still in reasonable condition and serviceable. And if you have had the cats removed, just think about the area that you live in, your emissions laws, your inspection laws. If it's mandatory for the original cats to be in place, then that could cause you issues further down the line when it comes to inspection time. And then looking in the boot, you want to be looking out for any moisture, any damp patches, any wet carpets. These cars have been known to let water in, and once that starts happening, once the seals start failing, once the drain holes get blocked, especially with leaves and bits and pieces over the years, once that water gets in, it can wreak havoc with the electrics, with the modules in the car. So just bear that in mind. If it is feeling all wet or full of moisture, then that could be a telltale sign of issues further down the road. Another super common E60 issue is the rear window rubber, the rear window seal. That can degrade over time, especially if you live in a warm, sunny climate. It's a super cheap part, super easy to replace, not such a big deal. And another wee trick you can look at after you've taken the car for a test drive, after the car's had a little bit of a run, just pop the fuel filler door there, take the cap off, and if you hear a whoosh of air, like it's gasping for air, that'll let you know that it's ready for a new charcoal canister. And check out the mirrors on the car, the mirror glasses. So you've got the wing mirrors, and this applies to the rear view mirror also. Now a lot of these were optioned with what they call electrochromatic glass, and what that is it's basically light sensitive, it's auto dimming, so at night time if you've got a car up behind you with its headlights on, it'll auto dim, so you've got that anti-glare when you're driving. Now what can happen over time is you can get like a bronzy colour on there, or like a murky bronzy colour. That means it's failing. Same with the rear view mirror, you'll get what looks like a liquid appearance in the mirror itself. Now if that is happening, just keep in mind that to replace the mirror glass itself is reasonably expensive. You're looking at $500 or $600 a piece. Okay, so moving inside the car, obviously just have a good look around. Just check out that the car's not in too much of a state. That'll give you a good idea of how it's been looked after over the years. Now it's worth having a good look at the seats. Most of these were optioned with merino leather. Now just check out the leather, the condition of it, make sure it's not all hard and cracked, make sure it's not all worn, torn or scratched, because with it being merino leather, it is a lot more expensive to get repaired than regular leather. Normal leather seats, it's just like a painted coating. These are actually dyed and unsealed, so it's worth just keeping that in mind. Check out the condition of them. Also check out the headliner and the pillar trims. Now most of these were optioned with Alcantara, and what can happen over time is they can, like any headliner, they can sag, the fabric can start coming away. Now with this being Alcantara, it's going to cost you a bit more money to get that sorted out later on. Now once you get sat inside the car that you're checking out, of course just go through all the usual things, check all the switchgear works, the heater, the air conditioning, the electric seats, the window switches, make sure everything's working as it should. And as with a lot of BMWs from this era, they use this soft touch coating on the plastics. Now it's not uncommon for all this to look fairly beat up around here, especially around the window switches there, around the panels here. And now if it is, don't be too perturbed, it's not a big deal to get these parts removed and get a paint shop just to get that tidied up for you. It's not a huge cost, so it's not a big deal. It is super common, and it's likely that the car you're looking at is going to have a bit of wear and a few marks there, just with the nature and the age of the car. Now as with most E60s, these cars have been known to have issues with the iDrive systems. So first off, when you first put the ignition on, you'll see it come up with the BMW loading logo there, and just make sure that that disappears and goes on to the next menu as we go. There we go. Now if it does freeze on the loading screen, that'll tell you that there's an issue with the system. If you don't get to the main menu here and it's just sticking on that BMW logo, the initial loading screen, you're going to have to look at getting this sorted out. It could mean the whole system will want replacing, the whole unit, or it could just be a software flash, but either way it's going to cost you a bit of money. Also, over the years, these have been known for they have like a cooling fan in the unit itself that can fail over time and then eventually burn the board out, so that can be a situation where you're replacing the unit also. So do keep that in mind. If there's a problem with that, there could be a reasonable cost involved in getting it sorted later on. And another thing that can contribute to the loading issues is that most of them have got a DVD navigation drive here. Now this car, the navigation units in the boot it's a hard drive system, but most of them are based on a DVD system. Mine's got a mini disc player here, but yeah, most of them have got the disc drive here. Now that unit can become faulty if the disc gets stuck and it's not reading. It can stop the whole unit from loading up properly, so that can contribute to it also. Just something to keep in mind. Also check out the tyres. First off, what type of tyre they've got on the car, what brand, what spec. Of course you want some decent rubber on these cars because it's a high performance car, high horsepower, so you don't want to be messing around when it comes to tyres. You want a decent set on the car. And then of course just check out the wear as well. If they're reasonably worn, that's going to be a cost that you're going to have to think about, because decent tyres aren't cheap. And these cars are getting on a bit now. Of course most of them are over 10 years old, so another thing that's quite common at this sort of age and mileage is the suspension wear. So when you do test drive the car, just have a listen out for any clunks or bumps and just any loose feeling in the suspension itself. It's not uncommon to have to replace control arm bushes, rear bushes, so do keep that in mind. It wouldn't be unreasonable if you need to go through and replace some of them items. Alright, so there we have it. I think we've touched upon some solid key points there. Now when you do go looking at one of these cars, the biggest thing is you don't want to be too concerned with the spec of the car, with the colour, which model year it is, or even the mileage itself. The biggest thing you want to be buying on is condition. So you want to be asking the owner about the service history. You want to be looking through that history, seeing what the car's had done to it, get a good idea of how the car's been looked after. So you want to be looking for one that's been looked after properly. And although you're going to have repairs in the future, it's going to mitigate some of them major repairs and major expenses, and that's just about the best you can do. Okay, so although we've touched upon some of the main points in this video, there will likely be little things here and there that I've missed. Please feel free in the comments below to mention anything that you guys are familiar with, you owners out there. Now I hope this video helped you guys out. I hope you found it interesting. Don't forget to give it a like and subscribe. Good luck in your search for finding a decent M5. I'm MTech Guy. Thanks for watching.